the first step before binding is to just make sure that you have the right size piece. You're not cutting it exactly to it. You're actually going to leave, at least 10 extra inches of binding at the end so that you have enough to work with to close your piece easily. In this case, I've already quilted some placemats. They're fairly stiff, but these are already quilted together, so I'm not worried about my layers shifting because it's already been quilted. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch, leaving some extra fabric at the end to the front of my placemat. I've lined the unfinished edge of my binding up with the unfinished edge of my placemat. I like to use my 1/4 inch foot for my machine. In this case, it doesn't really have a guide that holds the fabric, but it does show you where that 1/4 inch is. I'm going to do a straight stitch almost all the way to the corner. I'm going to leave a 1/4 inch away. I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch away from my unfinished edge. You could also use a walking foot for this part. It does work just fine. I like to backstitch when I get to the end. I'll cut my threads and pull it out. The next step of your simple binding to get a nice clean mitered corner is to take your binding and fold it towards the stitch line that you just saw. You're going to end up making a 45-degree angle with your fabric, and it should come off on a straight line from your edge that you're getting ready to sew. Now remember, we stitched a 1/4 inch. We stopped stitching a 1/4 inch away from our edge, so when we fold that back, it should fold back cleanly. So you're going to make that, kind of finger press that down to make it a nice clean corner, and then you're going to flip your fabric back towards the edge that you're getting ready to sew. Now, you'll want to make sure that you line up this edge of your fold with the uneven edge that you just sewed. Now, after you stitch this, if you have this folded correctly, to know that you did it right, you should have a flap here. You want that to be loose. You don't want to sew over that. When we start stitching on this next side, we're going to actually just start right at the edge, and that's going to allow us to go all the way to a 1/4 inch away from our next edge. So once you have that folded for your miter, you're going to take it back to your sewing machine, uneven edge, and actually just start right at the end. It's not necessary to go in a 1/4 inch. Keep sewing until you get a 1/4 inch away from the end. I like to back stitch just to lock that in place and cut my threads. Now I'm ready to prepare my second miter. Again, I fold back towards my stitching to make a 45-degree angle, and then again in a straight line, even with that edge, towards my next side. Turn and sew. Repeat the steps I just did for each corner. Toward your stitch line, 45-degree angle, flip back. You know you've got it right if that would stick up. line it up, turn, and sew. Don't worry about flipping your binding until after you've sewn all of your edges on. Now I'm on my last edge where we started sewing our binding. Remember, we're going to want to leave an opening in our binding. So a lot of times I like to put a pin in. I've left maybe 5 inches or so before my other stitching. Really, this distance is not going to matter at all for this method of binding. Using some of the other tools, it does matter because you use those stitch lines as your reference. I start this side in the exact same way to make my mitered corner. I'm going to stitch this on 1/4 inch from the edge up until I get to approximately that pin. When I get to the pin, I'm going to do a small back stitch so that it doesn't try to rip out when I'm working with this. The next step is what's really interesting. Now you've got your 2 leads of excess fabric. Take one of those leads and cut it off short, maybe about halfway through your fabric, and cut a straight line across your fabric. Now you've got this excess piece of fabric, but what's nice about it is what is our ruler. It is our tool. If you fold that fabric back out, you've got a 2.5 inch reference point. Now, we have cut a straight line, and I'm just going to straighten mine up a little bit because I like to do that. And we're going to lay the second piece over top of our first piece. Now, what's important here is you're going to be using the reference line for the end of the binding you just cut to mark on your binding here. You can use just a chalk marker, a pencil, anything that works, because most of this will be hidden underneath your fabric. You're going to make a mark on your binding, top binding, where that ends. Now, as it's laying across there, and I'm hoping you can see my marks here and here, kind of just go straight across my binding. What I'm going to do is take the piece that I cut and lay it on that line, and I'm going to mark 2.5 inches, or the width of that fabric, away. I've now got 2 sets of lines, and I've marked and given myself a reference of where I need to sew. The next step is to take this piece that you've just marked with 2 sets of lines and cut the excess fabric off of the end on the second line. You should still have 1 line remaining plus the end of your fabric. So now I've cut my ends. I've actually don't have enough of this side left to work with, so I'm going to rip a few of my stitches out since this is such a small edge, and I'm going to leave, so it would have been like a 10-inch opening like you would have done on a quilt. After you've done this, you're going to take it and put it right sides together, unfolded, crossed over. Now, in this case, you're going to bunch up your quilt or whatever you're working on. One side of your binding is going to line up with your marked line, and the other side is going to line up with the actual edge of your binding, so it should be perfectly even. You're going to sew the angle on this just like you would if you were attaching your binding pieces together. If you need to, go ahead and stick a pin in it to hold it in place while you position it under your sewing machine. So here, I'm lining up my pieces. You can see my marked line. I'm lining up finished edges to marked line. And we're going to sew in a straight line across the diagonal. You're going to position it under your foot. I like to get it there and drop my needle. It's like having an extra hand. Flatten out your binding as much as possible, and remember, these are right sides together. At this point, you've stitched your binding onto the front side all around your quilt. The next step is to flip it over, create your miters, and sew your binding down. I like to machine stitch my bindings on just because it's faster. If I have a special quilt, I might hand stitch it to the back side, but in this case I'm not going to see the back side. These are placemats and I'm not too worried about what that looks like. So because I used a 2.5 inch binding on this and it's not a super thick quilt, I'm going to have excess that's going to stick past my ditch when I fold over my binding. The important thing is when you fold the corners is to just fold that so that you get a nice clean miter. Machine stitching your binding to the front of your quilt is a really good opportunity to use what's called like a stitch in the ditch foot. This foot has a metal piece that comes down lower than the bottom of your foot, which could follow in your seam to keep it nice and straight. Your needle goes into the hole to the side of it to keep it even. So what I've done is I've just simply taken and folded over my binding. I haven't pressed it or anything. I know that I have enough excess to fit very smoothly over the back. And when I stitch in the ditch, it's going to catch my fabric on the back and leave a nice top stitch in the ditch on the front. I'm going to stitch in the ditch all along the edge of that quilt, making sure I keep, the thickness, the fold of my binding even as I go along. When you get to the corner, make sure that you have a good miter and that you don't stitch too far. You want to stop in that ditch. You might have to lift your foot slightly if it catches on your next set of binding, and then stitch slowly to that last corner piece and take a back stitch. So as you fold your fabric over in the bottom, you're going to want to check the miter on the back of your fabric as well. In this case, you're going to have a larger width on the back than you do on the front.